The sun was beginning to set on the small town of Brooksville, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The fading light bathed St. Mary's Church in an amber glow, its stone walls standing as a silent testament to centuries of faith and hope. Inside, the atmosphere was still. The dim lighting from the stained glass windows reflected hues of red and blue across the empty pews, except for one. At the front of the church, kneeling on the cold stone floor, was a young black woman. Her head bowed, hands clasped tightly in prayer. She was utterly alone. Her face, though serene, carried a weight of sorrow that seemed to seep into the very air around her. Tears slowly trickled down her cheeks, though she made no sound. Her name was Maya. In her late 20s, she had been through more than most would in a lifetime. A series of personal losses, including the death of her mother and a devastating breakup, had left her emotionally shattered. She had come to the church seeking solace, though she wasn't sure if she still believed in anything. It was more a desperate act, a hope that somehow, someway, she could find peace in this sacred space. The silence of the church was suddenly interrupted by the creak of the front door. A tall figure stepped in, his presence commanding yet respectful. Police Chief John Hayes, a man in his late 40s with a hardened face that had seen too much of the world's cruelty, entered the church quietly. His dark uniform contrasted with the soft glow of the sanctuary, and his eyes, often sharp and calculating, softened as they fell upon Maya. John wasn't particularly religious, but something had drawn him to the church that evening. A sense of restlessness had driven him away from his duties for a brief moment, leading him here. He had planned to sit in silence to think, maybe even to pray, though it had been years since he last attempted such a thing. But as he moved further into the church, he noticed Maya. He had seen her before, around town, always by herself. And tonight, there was something about her that seemed deeply broken. For a few moments, he stood there, unsure of what to do. He wasn't the type to intrude on people's private moments, but something in Maya's posture, the way her shoulders shook with silent sobs, compelled him. Against his usual instincts, John slowly walked down the aisle and, without saying a word, knelt beside her. Maya didn't move, but she felt his presence. For the first time in what seemed like years, she wasn't alone in her grief. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken pain, shared by two people who didn't yet know how connected they were. And in that moment, though no words were exchanged, something began to shift. The church, once a place of cold isolation, now held the fragile beginning of a connection. The silence between Maya and John stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with presence to souls, battered by life, existing together in a moment of stillness. The church, once an empty sanctuary, now felt heavy with the weight of shared sorrow. As Maya's tears slowed, her hands loosened from their tight grip. She had sensed John's arrival, but hadn't been ready to acknowledge him. Now, with her breath finally steadying, she opened her eyes and turned slightly to see the man kneeling beside her. Chief John Hayes had a reputation in Brooksville. He was known as a man of few words, a stoic leader who commanded respect. His dark eyes, framed by the lines of years spent in the field, gave away little of his emotions. But tonight, Maya saw something different in him. His posture was tense, not in authority, but in solidarity. His head was bowed slightly, and his hands rested calmly on his knees. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Maya felt an unexpected surge of emotion. She had come here to be alone, to escape the world, and yet this man, a complete stranger, had chosen to sit beside her. She wasn't sure if she felt gratitude or resentment. After all, how could someone like him understand the depth of her pain? John spoke first, his voice low and gravelly. barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. The words hung in the air, unclarified but powerful. Maya swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to respond, but her mind was racing. She had never spoken to John before, had only seen him passing by in town. And yet, here, they were two strangers bound together by an invisible thread of sorrow. She closed her eyes again, drawing in a shaky breath. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she finally admitted, her voice trembling. It was the first time she had spoken in hours. "I don't even know if I believe anymore." John nodded, though she couldn't see it. He understood that feeling all too well. Years on the force had shown him more than his fair share of suffering and loss. Over time, he had distanced himself from faith, from hope, from anything that required belief in something greater. He had grown used to fixing problems with his hands, not with prayers. "I'm not sure I do either," John replied, his words measured. "But sometimes it helps just to sit." Maya didn't respond, but his words resonated with her. She had spent so long running from her pain, trying to push it down or ignore it, that the idea of simply sitting with it, of allowing herself to feel it fully, was terrifying. But in this moment, with John beside her, she felt a small flicker of permission to stop fighting. After a long pause, Maya spoke again, this time more steady. "My mom passed away 3 months ago. I thought I was coping, but it just feels like it's getting worse." John's chest tightened. He knew what loss felt like, knew the hollow ache that followed in its wake. He had lost his wife 5 years earlier to cancer. Since then, he had thrown himself into his work, using the job as a shield to keep his emotions at bay. But hearing Maya's words brought back a rush of memories he had tried so hard to bury. "I lost someone too," John confessed, his voice softer than before. "My wife. It's been 5 years, but some days it feels like yesterday." For the first time, Maya looked directly at John, really seeing him. His face, though hardened by years of law enforcement, now seemed fragile, as if admitting his own pain had cracked open something he had been holding back. There was a moment of mutual recognition between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to be broken by loss. Maya felt her walls begin to crumble. She had been so consumed by her grief, by the belief that no one could understand her pain, that she hadn't realized how many people around her were suffering too. And now, sitting beside her in this sacred space, was someone who did understand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, echoing John's earlier words. But this time, it wasn't just an apology for herself. It was for him too. John looked at her, his eyes softening. "We don't have to be alone in this." The weight of those words hung heavy between them, but in that weight, there was also a glimmer of hope. For the first time in months, Maya felt that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry her grief by herself. The church seemed to grow quieter as the minutes passed, though neither Maya nor John moved from their place on the cold stone floor. Their shared silence, now filled with the weight of what they had confessed to each other, created an unspoken bond. The low flicker of candlelight reflected off the stained glass windows, casting dancing shadows across the room, mirroring the emotional shadows that still lingered in both their hearts. John felt an unexpected vulnerability rising within him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. The walls he had meticulously built around his emotions were slowly crumbling, brick by brick, in the presence of Maya's raw pain. His life, much like hers, had been defined by loss, but he had never faced it head-on. He had buried it deep, using his badge as a shield against the pain. Maya, on the other hand, had been swallowed whole by her grief. After her mother's passing, she had tried to hold everything together: her job, her friendships, her mental health. But slowly, everything had started to unravel. Her days became a blur of numbness, and her nights were filled with restless dreams of her mother's voice, calling out to her from a place she couldn't reach. The church had been her last hope, a desperate attempt to find some semblance of peace. But now, sitting beside John, she realized peace might not come from the silence she sought, but from the connections she had been avoiding. As if sensing the change in her thoughts, John spoke again, this time with more certainty. I used to think that the more I worked, the less I'd feel it, that if I kept moving, the grief couldn't catch up with me. Maya nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the altar. I thought the same. I tried to fill every moment with something, anything, just so I wouldn't have to think about it. But it never works. John sighed, the weight of years pressing down on him. No, it doesn't. A quiet creak echoed through the church as one of the pews shifted, reminding them both of the space they were in, a place that had seen countless prayers, confessions, and moments of vulnerability over the years. John's mind drifted back to his wife Laura. He hadn't visited a church since her passing, unable to confront the memories of the times they had spent together in quiet prayer, side by side. But tonight, something had drawn him here, something bigger than himself. Perhaps it was the need to finally face the grief he had been running from for so long. Maya, sensing John's silence, felt a strange sense of calm beginning to settle over her. She had spent so long feeling disconnected, detached from the world, and yet now, with this man beside her, she felt understood. Not because he had fixed anything he hadn't, but because he had acknowledged her pain, and in doing so, allowed her to acknowledge his. I used to come here with my mom, Maya said softly, her voice barely audible. She was the one who believed. She always told me that no matter how dark things got, there was always a light. But after she died, I stopped looking for it. John listened, not interrupting, allowing her to speak without judgment. I've been angry, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. Angry at the world, at myself, and sometimes at her. For leaving me. John's heart tightened at her words. He understood that anger, the irrational fury that came with losing someone you loved. He had felt it too, though he had never admitted it to anyone, not even himself. For years after Laura's death, he had buried that anger deep, convincing himself that it was wrong to feel it. But hearing Maya speak it aloud made him realize that perhaps it was part of the process, part of the long, winding road of grief. You're allowed to be angry, John said gently. You're allowed to feel whatever you need to feel. Maya looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. It's just I don't know how to move forward. I don't know how to live without her. John nodded, understanding all too well. It doesn't get easier, he admitted, his voice thick with his own emotion. But you learn how to carry it. Maya lowered her head, her heart heavy but somehow lighter than it had been when she first walked into the church. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. John smiled faintly, a sad but knowing smile. You are. You just don't see it yet. As the two sat together, the church around them seemed to shift, no longer a place of isolation, but one of shared humanity. They both carried scars, and though their wounds weren't healed, they had begun to acknowledge them. John stood slowly, his knees protesting after being on the cold stone for too long. He extended his hand to Maya, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. As he helped her to her feet, there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken promise that neither of them had to walk this road alone anymore. They stood together for a moment, side by side, looking up at the altar where the flickering candles seemed to glow a little brighter than before. Maya felt a small sense of release, as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it was lighter. And for now, that was enough. As Maya and John stepped outside St. Mary's, the cool night air greeted them. The last hues of sunset had disappeared, leaving the sky a deep indigo sprinkled with stars. It felt like the world had shifted, though nothing outside seemed different. The quiet of the night, however, was no longer the same kind of quiet that had existed inside the church. It wasn't hollow. It wasn't suffocating. It was full, carrying the whispers of unspoken things, shared grief, unhealed wounds, and the tentative beginnings of healing. They walked side by side, neither speaking for a while. The streets of Brooksville were nearly deserted, with only a few distant lights flickering from houses. John kept his pace slow, sensing that Maya wasn't quite ready to part ways yet. He wasn't either. "I don't know if I can go back home tonight," Maya admitted, her voice soft and uncertain. "Everything there reminds me of her. Every room, every scent." John understood. The memories attached to places the way they haunted you when you were least prepared could be overwhelming. After Laura's death, he had avoided their home for months, unable to face the empty rooms that once held so much life. He had eventually forced himself to go back, but it had never felt the same. The house had become more like a museum of the past, frozen in time. "You don't have to," John said after a moment. "You can stay with a friend, or even in a hotel for the night. Sometimes it's okay to give yourself some space." Maya nodded, though she hadn't really thought about it. She had been so focused on enduring her pain, forcing herself to stay strong, that she hadn't considered giving herself a break. Maybe that was part of why everything felt so heavy, because she had never allowed herself to put it down, even for a moment. As they walked, Maya's thoughts drifted back to her mother. There were good memories, of course, but recently it had been the painful ones that surfaced most often. She remembered the last weeks of her mother's life, the hospital room, the way her mother's hands had grown frail and cold. Maya had been there every day, refusing to leave her mother's side, even as the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. She could still hear the beeping of the machines, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the soft murmurs of the nurses. And then there was the silence. The moment when her mother's breathing had slowed to a stop and the world had become impossibly still. Maya blinked, shaking off the memory. She looked at John, wondering if he had gone through something similar with his wife. She wanted to ask, but the words felt too heavy to say out loud. John, as if sensing her thoughts, spoke quietly. "I was there when Laura died," he said, his voice barely audible over the sounds of their footsteps. "I watched her slip away. There was nothing I could do." Maya's heart ached for him. She had suspected his story would be similar to hers, but hearing it confirmed was different. The finality of death was something no one could truly understand until they had witnessed it firsthand. She knew that pain, the helplessness, the guilt, the endless questioning of what more could have been done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. John nodded, accepting her sympathy. It's strange how life just keeps going after that. How people expect you to move on, as if something so fundamental didn't just change in your world. Maya swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "I don't know how to move on," she admitted. "I don't even know what that means." John looked at her, his eyes filled with the same questions. "Maybe moving on isn't the right word," he said. "Maybe it's more about learning to live with it. Letting the pain be a part of you, but not letting it define you." Maya considered his words. She had spent so much time trying to run from her pain, to numb it or ignore it, that she had never thought about what it might mean to live with it, to allow it to exist without letting it consume her. Could that really be possible? "I used to think," Maya said, her voice hesitant, "that if I felt the pain too deeply, I'd break, that I wouldn't be able to come back from it." John gave a small, sad smile. "I think we all feel that way at some point, but we're stronger than we know, even when it feels like we're not." They continued walking, their pace unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world to sort through their thoughts. Maya's mind wandered back to her mother's words, the ones she had tried so hard to forget. Her mother had always believed in resilience, in finding light in the darkest of places. It was something she had instilled in Maya, though Maya had rejected it in the wake of her grief. "I think my mom knew," Maya said after a while, her voice soft, "that I would struggle after she was gone. She tried to prepare me, but I wasn't ready." John didn't respond immediately. He knew how it felt to be unprepared for the loss of someone you loved. No matter how much warning you were given, it never felt like enough. "You weren't supposed to be ready," John said finally. "No one ever is." Maya glanced at him, grateful for the understanding. They walked in silence for a while longer, the streets empty around them, as if the world was giving them the space they needed. Slowly, Maya felt a shift within her, not a solution, not an end to her pain, but a beginning. A beginning of acceptance, of allowing herself to feel without fear of breaking. Maybe John was right. Maybe it wasn't about moving on, but about learning to live with the ghosts of yesterday. As they reached the end of the street, Maya turned to John, her eyes reflecting a quiet strength she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. John nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You don't have to do this alone, Maya." For the first time in a long time, Maya believed that. She didn't have to be alone. As the quiet streets of Brooksville stretched ahead of them, Maya and John found themselves nearing the town's edge, where the sounds of the city gave way to the soft rustling of leaves in the nearby woods. The cool breeze carried with it the scent of pine and earth, a grounding reminder of the world beyond their thoughts. Maya felt a strange calm settle over her, though her emotions remained heavy. It wasn't the suffocating weight she had carried before, but rather the slow realization that the grief would never truly leave. It would always be with her, like a shadow. And yet, in John's presence, she felt a flicker of hope that she could learn to coexist with it. They stopped near the entrance to a small park, where a single bench overlooked a quiet pond. The water was still, reflecting the moonlight, and for a moment, the world felt suspended in time. John gestured toward the bench, and Maya nodded, grateful for the chance to sit. As they sat in silence, John's mind wandered to the many unspoken words he had kept locked inside since Laura's death. He had never talked about her much, not to his colleagues, not even to his closest friends. The pain of her loss had felt too personal to share with anyone. And so, he had kept it all inside, carrying it like a secret burden. But tonight, sitting next to Maya, he felt something stir within him, a desire to finally release some of that weight. "She used to love this park," John said quietly, his eyes on the still water. "Laura, I mean, we'd come here every weekend, just to sit and talk. She always said it was her favorite place because it was so peaceful." Maya glanced at him, sensing the vulnerability in his voice. It was the first time she had heard him speak about his wife in detail. There was a tenderness in his tone that contrasted with the hardened exterior he typically projected, and it made her realize just how much he had been holding back. "I wish I had known her," Maya said softly. "She sounds like she was wonderful." John nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "She was. She had this way of seeing the world like everything was filled with beauty, even the small things. I didn't always understand it at the time, but now I miss it more than anything." Maya could hear the love and the loss intertwined in his words, and it made her think of her mother. Her mother had been the same way, always finding joy in the little things: an afternoon cup of tea, the smell of fresh flowers, the sound of rain on the roof. Maya had always admired that about her, but had never fully understood it until now. "Do you ever feel like you didn't say enough?" Maya asked after a moment, her voice hesitant. "Like there were things you should have said, but didn't. John's face grew more solemn as he thought about her question. He hadn't expected it, but the truth of it hit him hard. There were so many things he hadn't said to Laura, things he had taken for granted, assuming there would always be more time. But time had run out, and the words had stayed locked inside. Every day, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I think about all the things I didn't say. The I love yous that I should have said more often. The thank yous for all the little things she did. I think I didn't realize how much I would miss those moments until they were gone. Maya's heart clenched at his confession. She had her own unspoken words, her own regrets. She had spent so much time in her mother's final days trying to be strong, trying to hold everything together, that she hadn't allowed herself to simply be present with her. There were so many things she hadn't said: how much she loved her, how much she appreciated everything her mother had done for her, how scared she was to live without her. I didn't say goodbye, Maya whispered, her voice breaking. I sat with her every day, but when the end came, I couldn't bring myself to say goodbye. I didn't want it to be real. John looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. He had felt the same way with Laura. The finality of death was something that no one could truly prepare for, and in those last moments, saying goodbye felt impossible. You don't have to feel guilty for that, John said gently. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is accept that it's the end. It doesn't mean you loved her any less. Maya nodded, though her chest tightened with the weight of her unspoken words. She had spent so long replaying those final moments in her head, wondering if she had done enough, said enough. But maybe John was right. Maybe the love she had shown in all the other moments, in all the ways she had cared for her mother during her illness, had been enough. Do you ever talk to her? Maya asked suddenly, surprising even herself with the question. John looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. You mean Laura? Maya nodded. I mean, not out loud, but in your thoughts. Do you ever talk to her, even though she's gone? John considered her question. It wasn't something he had thought about much, but as he sat there, he realized that he did, in a way. He often found himself thinking about what Laura would say in certain situations, how she would react, or what advice she would give. In that sense, she was still with him, still a part of his life, even though she wasn't physically there. Yeah, John said quietly. I do. Sometimes I ask her what she thinks I should do. Or I think about what she would say to me if she were here. Maya smiled faintly. I've been doing that too. With my mom. I think it helps, in a way, to keep them with us, even if it's just in our thoughts. John nodded, his heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. Maybe that was the key, not trying to move on, but finding a way to carry the ones they had lost with them, in the small moments, in the quiet thoughts. As they sat together, the night stretching out around them, there was a quiet peace between them. The unspoken words that had weighed so heavily on their hearts seemed to lift, carried away by the breeze that rustled the trees around them. They didn't have to say goodbye. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The night deepened, but the connection between Maya and John grew stronger as they sat by the pond. The silence between them now was different, no longer filled with pain and unspoken words, but with a quiet understanding. The stars above reflected on the still surface of the water, shimmering like distant memories, reminding them both that life continues, even through loss. John, for the first time in years, felt a small weight lift off his shoulders. Talking about Laura, acknowledging his grief, and sharing it with someone who truly understood it was like opening a door he had kept closed for too long. He had spent years believing that being strong meant hiding his pain, but tonight he realized that strength came from allowing himself to feel it. Maya, too, felt a shift within her. The anger, the guilt, the overwhelming sadness, they were still there, but they no longer consumed her. Sitting beside John, she realized that healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the pain. It meant learning to live with it, to let it coexist with her love and memories. For a long while, they simply sat in silence, watching the reflections on the water. The stillness was comforting, and for the first time in a long time, Maya didn't feel the need to run from her thoughts. She let herself remember her mother, the way she used to hum while cooking, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her embrace. They were painful memories, but they were also beautiful, and Maya realized that she didn't want to lose them, even if they hurt. "I think she'd be proud of you," John said suddenly, breaking the silence. Maya looked at him, surprised. "My mom?" John nodded, his gaze still on the water. "For how you've handled everything. I can't imagine it was easy, but you're still here. You're still fighting." Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She had never thought of it that way. In her mind, she had been failing to cope, failing to move on. But John's words made her realize that surviving in itself was a form of strength. "I don't feel strong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. John turned to her, his eyes soft with understanding. "Strength isn't about feeling invincible. It's about getting through the days, even when they're hard. It's about showing up, even when you don't know how you're going to make it through." Maya let his words sink in. She had spent so much time believing that she had to be strong in the traditional sense, stoic, composed, unbreakable. But maybe strength was something quieter, something softer. Maybe it was in the simple act of continuing, even when everything felt impossible. As they sat together, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a start, a beginning of something new. John, too, felt a quiet shift within him. He had spent so long closing himself off, convinced that vulnerability was a weakness. But tonight, with Maya, he realized that opening up, sharing his pain, had made him feel more human, more connected than he had in years. Laura's memory felt closer now, not as something painful to avoid, but as a part of him that he could carry forward. After a while, John stood, offering Maya his hand. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's take a walk." Maya took his hand, rising from the bench. They walked along the edge of the pond, their footsteps quiet on the gravel path. The moonlight illuminated the trees around them, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. As they walked, Maya felt a question bubbling to the surface, one she hadn't dared to ask before. "Do you ever feel guilty?" she asked softly. For trying to move on? John didn't answer immediately. He had asked himself that question so many times since Laura's death. In the early days of his grief, the mere thought of continuing his life without her had felt like a betrayal. How could he live, laugh, or even enjoy the simplest moments, knowing that she was gone? But over time, he had come to realize that living didn't mean forgetting. "I used to," John finally replied, his voice thoughtful. "I used to think that moving on meant leaving her behind. But now I think it's about honoring her, about carrying her with me in everything I do." Maya nodded, understanding his words in a way she hadn't before. "I think I've been afraid of that, of what it means to move forward without her." John looked at her, his expression kind. "You don't have to let go of her. You can bring her with you. In the way you live your life, in the choices you make, in the love you carry forward." Maya felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She had been so focused on the idea of letting go, of somehow moving past her mother's death, that she hadn't realized she could take her mother's memory with her. It didn't have to be something she left behind. "I don't know if I'm ready," Maya said quietly, more to herself than to John. John smiled softly. "You don't have to be." Healing isn't something you rush. It's something you walk through, one step at a time. They continued walking, the path ahead illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. The night air was crisp, carrying with it a sense of renewal. For the first time in a long time, Maya didn't feel lost. She didn't feel like she had to have all the answers. She just had to keep walking, one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The following days passed quietly, with Maya returning to her daily routine, but feeling a subtle shift inside her. The conversations with John had left her with a newfound perspective, not one of complete healing, but of possibility. She began to allow herself to feel, to think of her mother without pushing the memories away. Each time the ache of loss surfaced, she reminded herself of what John had said. You don't have to let go. You can carry her with you. John, too, felt a change. For the first time in years, he visited Laura's grave. It wasn't as painful as he had anticipated. Instead of overwhelming sadness, there was a quiet sense of peace. He stood there, thinking about the moments they had shared, the life they had built together. He didn't feel the need to run from those memories anymore. He allowed them to wash over him, bringing both joy and sorrow, but with an understanding that this was how he would keep her with him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya found herself back at St. Mary's Church. It had been a week since her last visit, and something inside her urged her to return. The church was empty when she arrived, the soft glow of candles lighting the interior in a warm, welcoming way. She walked slowly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the vast space, and found herself kneeling at the same spot where she had prayed that night with John. But this time, the weight of loneliness didn't hang over her. There was no overwhelming need for answers, no desperate cry for something beyond her to take the pain away. Instead, there was acceptance. Acceptance that her journey through grief would be long and winding, with no clear end in sight. But that was okay. She was no longer afraid of the emotions she carried. As she bowed her head in prayer, she whispered quietly, "I miss you, Mom, but I'm going to be okay." For the first time, the words didn't feel hollow. After a few moments, Maya stood and turned to leave, only to find John standing at the entrance. His eyes met hers, and they shared a small, knowing smile. He hadn't planned on coming back to the church either, but something about this place, the quiet, the stillness, had drawn him in again. It was no longer a place of isolation. It was a place where, somehow, they had both found a sliver of peace. They walked together once more, out into the evening air, the fading light casting long shadows on the ground. The streets were quiet, just as they had been that night, but there was a sense of something new in the air, a sense of hope, however faint. As they reached the corner where they had parted ways before, Maya turned to John. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." John smiled, a warmth in his eyes. "I should be thanking you. I hadn't realized how much I needed this." Maya looked at him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. In sharing their pain, they had both begun to heal, even if the process was just beginning. She had spent so long believing that she had to carry her grief alone, but now she knew better. There were people unexpected, perhaps, who could walk alongside her. "Do you think it gets easier?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John considered her question for a moment. "I don't know if it gets easier," he said honestly, "but I think we get better at living with it." Maya nodded, letting his words settle in her mind. Maybe that was the key, not expecting the pain to disappear, but learning how to live with it, day by day, moment by moment. As they stood there, the sky darkening above them, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not the naive kind that promises everything will be perfect, but the kind that says things can get better, even if only a little at a time. "I think you're right," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We get better at living with it." They stood in silence for a few more moments before John finally spoke again. "If you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Maya smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. "Same goes for you." With that, they parted ways once more, walking in opposite directions, but knowing that their paths would cross again. As Maya walked home, she looked up at the stars, remembering something her mother used to say: "Even in the darkest nights, the stars still shine." She had never truly understood the meaning behind those words until now. Grief would always be a part of her life, but it didn't have to define her. She could carry it with her, along with the love, the memories, and the strength her mother had given her. And she could move forward step by step, day by day, with the knowledge that she wasn't alone. There would be more difficult days ahead, more moments where the weight of her loss would feel unbearable. But there would also be moments of light, small, quiet moments like this one, where the pain softened and hope flickered just enough to keep going. Maya walked into the night, her heart a little lighter, knowing that somehow she would be okay. And somewhere in the distance, the stars continued to shine,